So it's late Thursday night, and you have a big 15-page research paper due the next morning, and you're scrambling to pull the thing together. You're pulling quotes from different articles and throwing them in there as you can, and you remember a few ideas, really important ideas, but you're not exactly sure where they came from or what source they came from, or maybe you just can't remember where within a source it came from specifically. So you just decide, you know what, I don't have time to look it up. I don't have time to dig around. So I'm just going to throw it in there and hope for the best. Sound familiar? Many of us have been in a situation like that. But what's happened in this scenario is that now this person, if that's you or me or anyone else, has now engaged in plagiarism. How do we define plagiarism? Well, the Indiana University Tutorial Writing Service has a really good, succinct, simple definition of plagiarism. They say that plagiarism is using others' ideas and words without clearly acknowledging the source of that information. In a nutshell, it's ripping off someone else's ideas and claiming them for yourself. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes we think that's a matter of intent, right? So if you intend to do that, then you're guilty of plagiarism. But actually, it really has very little to do with intent, and it has to do with what the actual outcome of your writing is, or what ends up in your writing itself, regardless of that intent to plagiarize or not to plagiarize. And so in a lot of cases, plagiarism is unintentional. Someone has been in the scenario that we mentioned earlier, or has inserted something into their writing that they weren't aware to their own memory, or they couldn't recall, was a reference to someone else's work. And in that case, it still doesn't matter. It's still plagiarism. So plagiarism is serious. It is something that can severely damage your work, your reputation, and the reputation of others. So I want to give you a couple examples of what I mean by this, a couple of scholarly examples of this. So there was a New Testament scholar by the name of Peter O'Brien, and he wrote several commentaries. He was a fairly well-known and well-respected scholar. He had written commentaries on Hebrews and a few of Paul's letters, and so he had written this commentary in the Pillar New Testament commentary series on the book of Hebrews. And one day a student in Asia, I believe, was doing some research and was writing an exegetical paper, or writing an article, and submitted it, and it got flagged for plagiarism. And when that student was addressed about his plagiarism, he said, well, I was just doing what I saw in a commentary that I used. And said, what commentary are you talking about? And so they went back and they looked and they saw Peter O'Brien's commentary, and they analyzed it, or they reviewed it. They sent it back to the publisher, sent word back to the publisher, and they reviewed it. And come to find out, when they compared it to another commentary on Hebrews, it was almost word for word. Now, you would think instantly, oh, he must have just copied that down, right? But he's a scholar. The scholars do those sorts of things. That happens sometimes. But in this case, it was unintentional plagiarism. So he had been a student under this particular professor that he had ended up plagiarizing, and had many conversations over the years, taken notes, and from those conversations and discussions over and correspondences over issues related to their work. And so tucked those away, and then when he went to go do some writing, pulled them back out, but had not written down that they came from that scholar. And so he just assumed that they were from his own work. And so he included it in there, and turns out, again, it was word for what his mentor had said to him years prior. At the end of the day, it was unintentional. But when it ended up happening is they pulled all those copies, refunded everyone who had them, and then also did a review of all his work and found several other instances of plagiarism for the same reason. And as a result of that, then much of his work was discredited. He was in the final stages of his career, so in many ways he kind of rode off, but his reputation has been battered or bruised, at least in many ways, because of that. So imagine being him and having your life work kind of thrown up for scrutiny at the end because of some unintentional plagiarism. Another scholar to mention would be Andreas Kostenberger, who did a similar thing. He had a research assistant who was doing a lot of research for him, and that research assistant didn't write down where he had gotten his information from, and so Kostenberger took those notes and assumed that some of that material was his own, summaries from that research assistant of his own work, and he included it in his commentary on John in the Baker exegetical series and then another series, and it got flagged, and turned out it was word for word what another scholar had said. And again, it was unintentional, right? And but it also threw into question a lot of his work. And so again, same sort of thing. Some review of his work was done, and now there'll be some red flags when it comes to the work that he's done. He's probably mid-career or later career, but so I say all this not to scare you necessarily, but just to say that plagiarism is serious and we should take it seriously. How can you avoid plagiarism? You can avoid it by citing your sources and being careful about citing your sources and creating a system of citation. So that means when you're reading works, when you're reading an article or a book, you're taking good notes. In your notes, you're writing down where it comes from and who it comes from very carefully. And then if you have question about whether or not you should cite something or not, just go ahead and cite it. As I said in an earlier video, you'll never be counted off for citing something that you don't need to cite. You'll always be counted off for the opposite, and in fact, it could get even worse, could escalate from there. So you don't want your work thrown into question and your academic career thrown into question because of unintentional plagiarism. So one other thing I want to mention about plagiarism, and that is the idea of collaborative plagiarism. So sometimes we think about plagiarism as this kind of isolated incident where I'm just me and my books, and I just didn't cite something properly. There are also instances that have occurred of plagiarism from collaboration. So a student takes a class and has a friend who took that same class a couple semesters before and says, hey, you know that paper that we wrote in that class? Could I just look at your paper just to get a sense for what the structure's like and kind of what they're looking for, what the professor's looking for on that paper? And you say, oh yeah, I trust you, no big deal, here, I want to help out too. So you hand them your paper. And then that student takes, I really like this, and then takes portions of that, or maybe more than portions of it, and includes that in their own work, maybe with good intentions, if there can be, or not, and then turns it in. Well, nobody will know. I can just take this section here or there, or just one, a few sentences here, a few sentences there. And the next thing you know, that gets flagged because it gets put in, turn it in, and there was a previous paper 2 semesters before that had the same exact wording, and it gets flagged. And not only is the person who plagiarized in trouble, but now you're in trouble for having lent out your paper to somebody else. So I say all that to say, be careful what you do with your work after you have created your work. It's okay to help one another, and there are good ways to collaborate and research, but at the end of the day, you should be careful about handing your work to other people, even if they're people you can trust. Sometimes, again, we can, in a moment of weakness or unintentionally plagiarize or do something we shouldn't do in cases like that. So anyway, be careful about your citation. Make sure you cite your sources, and if you do that, you can be sure that you'll avoid plagiarism.